Hello everyone and welcome to the 7th part of this character modeling tutorial series. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about how to create outlines using the inverted Hall method, how to make a simple shading setup for your materials in this particular style. We'll talk about how to plan the hair, and then we'll go through the time lapse of this week's progress. So let us get started. First and foremost, let us talk about how to create outlines. It is one of the things that we'll definitely need, and there's generally speaking two approaches to this topic. There is of course the freestyle line rendering engine in Blender, but I choose still to use something called the inverted Hall method because to me it gives me more control over the line width and it's just more comfortable to use for me. But I have seen artists do very good things with freestyle as well, so I hope you don't take this as the one and only way how you should do it. It's just the one way that I choose for this project. To understand the inverted Hall method, there is first of all this concept that you need to understand: normals. We'll be talking about this more in the future as well, but basically a face normal is the facing direction of a polygon, and the polygon is basically a face in 3D. So I've tried to illustrate this here with this image. You see that you have a face, and the red arrow indicates the direction in which the face is facing. So if you take a cylinder here, for example, you can see how these faces all have different normals. And now when we look at this shape here, we can already imagine that some of the faces will be facing towards us while some others will be facing away from us. And we can visualize that with two colors in this way. And whether these faces face towards us or whether they face away from us is going to be a very important concept. But let's switch very quickly over to Blender just for a second to see how we can visualize these normals. So here we are in Blender, and there's a quick way how you can visualize normals. First of all, you have to go into edit mode to be able to see them, and then you go in here into the display settings and you just click on the normals here. This one will give you the face normals, and that's the one that matters to us at the moment. There's other types of normals, but I don't want you to bother yourself with them too much at the moment. We'll talk about those later when we go to normal editing. But for now, just remember that the face normal indicates, the direction the face is facing. And so now that you know what a normal is, let us talk about the second concept that you need to understand. There is something called backface culling, and it basically is a feature that allows you to hide the backside of a face. So do you remember this shape? We talked already about it, that some of the faces we're looking at from the back side. And by activating backface culling, you can basically hide those faces. And it might seem strange and, maybe you're not sure what this could even be used for, but we can take advantage of this feature. It was not created for the purpose of outlines, I believe, but it's very useful for what we are going to do. So let me show you how you can do that in Blender. So here we are in Blender one more time. Let me create some sort of shape, and I will just make a bit of a cutaway so that we have actually some faces pointing away from us, where some faces are pointing towards us. And now you have to differentiate between a render view, like the material preview or the rendered view, and the solid view. They have a little bit of a different concept. In the solid view, you can basically go to this viewport shading setting here and activate backface culling, and then you have it already. You can see that only part of your mesh is now visible, but as soon as you go to rendered, that will be visible again, and the same thing happens with the material preview. So actually only in solid we really get that effect. So in order to get the same effect in the rendered view, you have to create a material, and in here there's a setting called backface culling, and by activating that you get now the same effect in all of your display modes. Now that you have understood all the concepts that we need, let us take a look at how to create outlines. So there is something called the inverted hull method, and I believe it's best described visually. So let's take a look. Imagine you have some sort of mesh, some sort of geometry, which is the black part. And now you make a copy of that geometry and you offset it a little bit along its normal outwards. And then you flip the normals around. So you get basically what you see here at the moment in this illustration. The inner black part of the mesh has the normals facing outwards, and the red part, the duplicate of the mesh, has the normals pointing inwards. And now imagine that backface culling is turned on for the red part of the mesh. Now the yellow arrow indicates our camera, our viewing direction. You can imagine that if we look at the mesh from the direction as it is indicated, we will not be able to see the red part of the mesh because it's facing away from us. However, we will be seeing the black part of the mesh, which is the object that we want to be shading and seeing. But now let's imagine we're looking at this object from a very steep angle, and this would mean that we're looking at the outline of the object. Again, our viewing angle hits the red mesh first, but we can't see it at the beginning. But we barely miss the black part of the mesh. So in the end, what we end up seeing is the point where our viewing ray would exit the red mesh again. And so that's how, if we have given this red part of the mesh a dark material, how in that situation only we would end up seeing an outline. And now to show you how this is done in Blender, let's switch over very quickly to go through the setup process. So here we are in Blender one more time, and I will create one more time a new mesh. Let's go again with our torus. We can give it a few more subdivisions just to make it cleaner, and smooth it out if you want. So of course you could go in and duplicate your mesh, and you could scale it up a little bit, but with this one like this. But this is going to be a little bit annoying to do every time, so there is a simpler way to do that automatically with modifiers. So what you want to do is you go to your modifiers and you use the solidify modifier. Use this modifier and give it a thickness, and what you want to do is, what this modifier basically does is it gives you thickness to your mesh, and you will need to invert the offset to 1 and give it a thickness of whatever you want your line thickness to be. And then let's take very quickly a look at the here at the face orientation, and you see that blue means we're looking at the front side of the face. But if you click here on flip normals, now we look at the back side of the face, and when hiding it so we can see the inner ring, that's still normal. So basically our normals are now correct, and even if I edit let's turn that off quickly, face orientation, and even if we edit the mesh, you still get your copy the way we would want it to be. I've wanted wise though, in this case it won't make much of a difference, but usually your mesh is going to have lots of sharp corners too. By activating clamp and giving it something like 1 as a value, it gives you more dynamic lines, and it helps you avoid various artifacts that you can run into. But how do we get the normals to work on this now? You will need 2 materials, and I'm not going to go too much into the details here now. Let's just make one bright material and one dark material, and just so that it shows up in the viewport as well, let's turn this one to black here as well. Something like this should be good. And now let's take a look, but it's still the same white material. So what you want to do is you go back to your modifier and you say that the duplicate mesh should be using the material at the index 1, which is here. But now everything is black, and that is because backface culling is still not enabled. So let's go to solid view, and for solid view you just click here and that activates backface culling, and all of a sudden you have outlines and they look pretty good, and from any angle they look nice. And you have to do the same thing one more time for the rendered view, because that time you want to select your black material and you go into your shader settings and activate backface culling here. And then you have the same effect in any view, in your render and in your preview, and everything is good. You should know though that there are some little artifacts such as these inner corners, but this is sort of the downside of using the inverted hull method. That's something you just have to live with, and if you don't like it, maybe look into freestyle for ways to avoid this artifact. Now finally it is time for us to talk about the shading setup. Basically there are two types of shaders that we will likely need throughout this tutorial. One of them is a cell shader, which is basically a shader that has two colors only for shaded areas and for bright areas, and then we'll need a solid shader. So first of all, let's take a look at how to achieve solid colors in Blender. Here we are back to Blender, and I'm still in this scene so that we can take a look at these two materials in context. The first thing that you want to do is go to your render settings, into your color management, and switch from filmic to standard. The reason why I do this is because colors will be misrepresented if you're in filmic mode. Filmic is great for photorealistic stuff, but in this case, where we just want to have plain colors, you might not want these colors to be changed. I can switch back later to give you a demonstration, but let's move forward for now. Now, basically, in order to achieve a solid color, it's very simple. Instead of the principled BSDF shader, you just want to go to an emission shader, and the emission shader has only one color anyways. You just give it the color that you want it to be. Let's pick some red or something. I can also copy this color into my viewport settings just so that we get an indication. But now if I go to the rendered view, it's always going to be this solid color. Whether we have a light or not, it doesn't really matter. It's always like this. And that's how you set up a solid color. Now let us talk about the shaded color. So this time I'll use my other material to set that up. We will be using shader nodes to create this material, so I'm going here into my shader editor. And one more time, again, I don't need this principled BSDF shader, I'll just delete it. Instead, I'll just go with a diffuse shader and I'll set that to white. Now, there is a converter called shader to RBG. You want to use this one and just connect these together. And then you will need an emission shader. And if you remember, everything that is in here will be a flat color. But if we connect this shader to RGB into the RGB channel of emission, basically this will turn one more time into a diffuse shader, with the only difference that now we have the ability to modify what happens inside. Let me just quickly create a light at this point so that we can actually see some changes here. We can go with the sun maybe. So it already looks like as if we had two colors, but that's only because our lamp is very bright. Let me turn it down quickly. There we go. So here we are with just a normal shaded diffuse material. But now we can go in here and manipulate this gradient. One way of doing this is to use a math node. You could, for example, say everything that is greater than, let's see if I can find it. Here it is, greater than a certain value will be white, everything that's darker will be black. And That's perfect because it gives us very, very sharp lines without any gradient. And there's one nicer way to choose the two colors that you will be seeing here, because at the moment it's just black and white. But you can go into color and choose mix RGB node, and you want to plug this output into the factor value here. Now you can individually choose just the color that you want, anything really, and you'll get a result like this. By the way, at this point, let me demonstrate to you what the difference between Filmic and sRGB, the standard view transform is. You see that this one represents the colors way more accurate and exactly actually according to what you have selected here. But let me show you one more thing. We chose the greater than node here to create this transition here, but you can also use something called the color ramp. And in the case of the color ramp, you get to sort of move around this gradient. If you bring these closer together, you can see that this will be now a smooth transition, but you can manipulate it, and you could even do things that are in between. So let's say I create 3 of these, and let me switch here to constant. Now you see that I could, for example, create a shader with 3 tones. And that's also something that might be useful to us when creating shaders. So this is the basic shader setup. You have a shaded material here, you have a solid material here, and don't forget, of course, that you can also assign some part of the mesh to your other material. So if I just assign the selection to my second material, well then the lower side will always be dark and only the upper part is being shaded. So that's some nice things to know. And now let us go back to the slides for a second. So now it's time for us to talk about the hair layout. Basically, you want to have a plan before you start modeling your hair. And it's best to think about your hair in chunks. So quickly, let us take a look at our character design for a second. And I would say that these two areas here are the most sort of primary shapes that you have in your hair. And therefore, I want to be creating those separately, just so that I can create them as clean as possible. In fact, I've even decided to break down the back part of the hair into even more sections, so that the front and the back part are sort of these cap sections, you know, and the side parts are just bent down planes almost. So the shape can be very much simplified by thinking of your hair in parts. And of course, things like ponytails and those sort of things would be separate shapes as well. And I recommend one more time this video by a version of Reality, and it goes through one of the techniques that you can use for creating hair. And the approach that I will be using in this tutorial series is also based on this particular video. And now with that out of the way, there's only one more thing left to do, which is to take a look at the time lapse of what I've been working on in the last week, and I'll be commenting on the side a couple of things to point out how I approached this modeling hair creation process. So here we are then one more time in Blender, and this week sort of the work that I did turned out to be a very long process. It took me almost 5 hours to create the entire hair. So it's going to be difficult for me to fit everything into this video. I will be only commenting on sort of the most important parts, and don't forget that I will be publishing the real-time version. I mean, I hope I'll be able to provide it in real time. Maybe I'll speed it up to twice the speed, but you should be able to see all the details. I'll upload that on Monday, at least that's the plan. So let me describe what I'm doing here. I'm following the technique that I've learned from the video that I have previously linked and mentioned. So basically the technique works in the following way. You create a plane that is just, you know, a plane with lots of subdivisions, And I'm using a lattice object, which is sort of a deformer, sort of a volumetric grid that allows you to deform meshes. And then this lattice object will undergo quite a couple of transformations itself. So first of all, I'm using a curve to sort of along one axis bend the lattice, and then I'm using a simple deform to another time sort of bend my lattice around another axis, and then you get sort of a segment of a sphere, but it ends up being a little bit too regular, and so that lattice gets yet another deform applied to it, which is a secondary lattice. So I'm using a lattice to deform my lattice, which deforms the mesh. So it's very complicated, and I recommend you take a look at the other video that was mentioned before, so that you can really follow along and take this step by step. But that's basically the approach I'm taking, and I will be using similar approaches for the other parts of the hair. Now here's something interesting that I'm doing right now. I figured out that it would be quite difficult to sort of modify this mesh if it is in its deformed state. So one thing that you can do to allow yourself to edit this object in a plane form, although you have it deformed, is you make a copy, not by using Shift D, but by using Alt D. And Alt D is a linked copy. So it's a separate object, but the mesh is the same instance. So if you go into edit mode with one of those two copies and change something, the moment you leave edit mode, the changes will be applied to the original. And since it's a different object, though, you can disable and delete the modifiers. So that will allow you to basically put it back into its flat shape, while the other copy, the other instance of that mesh, is still deformed and is basically giving you your final result for the hair. So that's what I'm doing here, and it took quite a lot of time to sort of get the curve right and the lattice right. That's why I like to have a sculpt below, because it helps me to really focus on just matching the overall volume instead of trying to imagine what it might look like towards the end. But anyways, you see me here now actually going in and making some cuts, and at this stage I'm just doing a very, very rough draft. I will be remaking that later, but for now I just wanted to sort of get the volumes in. And that's basically the process. So I've decided to skip here over one part of this recording, just a little bit, because here is now the part where I begin to remake this mesh. I want this mesh to be as clean as possible with very straight lines, and so I'm separating it here into its sections before sort of giving it its separation. And you see how I first start with sort of a very big chunk of hair, and then I give it separation into smaller strands. So start out with the big part and then go smaller. And one little advice to make modeling easy for you is that you can definitely copy some parts of the strands. You can see that right here I'm taking one part that I've already modeled, and I'm reusing it for other parts. Of course, you should give it variation, and you should make sure that in the end you get the form that you wanted. But there's nothing against, just copying some parts and bringing them into those places where you want them to be. Same thing goes for mirroring. So in a second here, you'll see how I take this sort of in-between section that I've just created, and I'll be mirroring it on the other side. And now the next part is, of course, giving this whole thing volume, which is sort of an important step, and I've experimented a little bit with different ways of doing it. Initially, I thought that it would be nice if I could do this with a modifier, because always, if you can do something with a modifier, it allows you to go back later on and make some changes. And I tried that basically by giving it a solidify modifier, but that didn't turn out too nice. So instead what I did here was I made sure that I have a copy of this mesh, of course, in case I wanted to go back, but then I gave it a little bit of height information. So I took just the middle section, and with a very soft fall off with the proportional editing tools, I moved it out. Then I copied the whole thing, I mirrored it to the back, and I made sure that the tips and the root go together and join at one point. And this gives me sort of this thickness, which you can see here on the screen at the moment. And because I also want to use subdivision surface modifiers at some point, I make sure that I apply creased edges to all the sharp edges, of course, because that will allow me to increase the resolution. And it's important to do that before you apply the lattice, because the lattice already does a very smooth transformation. So it's better to subdivide things before. And then finally, I know already that my hair will have sort of these shaded areas in between the strands. So I'm selecting the sort of the upper edge, and I'm shifting those inwards. Now it's kind of a bit of a tedious process and something I could not find a way for to automate it, but it does make a big difference to have this. So it is a feature that I definitely recommend. There is, however, other ways to do it. You could have more properly separated strands, or you could choose to not have these shaded areas in between. It all depends on your style. And in this sort of stylized world anyways, all decisions should be made based on what will fulfill your vision. So in my case, that's my approach. I'm doing my best here to give all these lines a very smooth curve, and towards the end you will see how I'll be able to apply this. By the way, to easily crease all my sharp edges, you can use F3 to go to the feature search, and you can search for a feature called select sharp, and that will give you a threshold to select sharp edges. Now at this point I want to go into the material setup, and you can see that I'm setting here up a material very similar to what I described earlier in this video. That's why I separated sort of the theory from the real-time, the time-lapse recording, just so that you can learn the theories at your own pace, while now we can look at how I brought all those techniques together into one thing. So here I used that sort of shader to give it some nice stylized shader, and I want to make sure that you know that the flat surfaces on top, they have a shaded material, but those in between sections, those have a flat material. So regardless of whether light is hitting those areas or not, we're getting some darker colors there. And finally, I used the inverted hull method, as I described before, with the solidify modifier to give it some outlines. And just make sure that you use the clamp feature in this modifier, because that will allow you to reduce a lot of artifacts. And with that out of the way, it is now time to move on to the next part, which is sort of the middle section. And as I described before in the hair layout part, I decided to sort of separate the backside from the sides of the hair. And I'm doing this so that I can focus here on sort of a very simple deformation process. I'm doing this, by the way, because it allows me to get very, very smooth shapes, which is good for this sort of style. Now, although in theory this whole process might seem quite simple, this is where I actually got into this cycle of doing lots of mistakes and having to repeat this process over and over. So the first thing that I tried here is to use a curve with a lattice, same thing basically as I did with the front hair, but this turned out to have some issues with the whole thing just ending up needing too much sort of extra input. It just had, the lattice had too many points, and I then started thinking, well, why do I even need sort of 3 points in this sort of depth axis? why can't I just use a lattice with sort of no depth at all, just a plane basically. That would make the whole thing a lot easier. So then I tried that as well. I tried to use this lattice without depth, but then I realized something which was quite frustrating, because I didn't realize that if I would use the lattice without thickness, that I wouldn't be able to give the transformer the information about how to bend it. It could only sort of shift my points, and the issue that would arise is that when I use the solidify modifier at first, that the thickness that I had, the lines would be affected by this transformation. It's a bit hard to describe, but there was just no good workaround. I could have used the solidify modifier after using my lattice, but I wanted to avoid that because that would just increase the number of artifacts that I get. By the way, I also want to point out that this time I tried to use a solidify modifier to give my hair the thickness, and I was able to sort of modify the gradient by using weight painting tools. That allowed me to sort of give it a thickness as you can see at the moment, but I ended up not using that because it didn't give me enough control after all. I wanted to, of course, create sort of those beveled edges for the top side just to give it a little bit of a nicer shading, and also sort of at the root I wanted to delete some of the rims, but that was not possible either. You can see that this whole process was quite a big struggle for me, and sort of to continue this episode of struggles, there was again another issue with mirroring these parts. I tried to use a duplicate lattice, sort of a linked lattice, to modify this mesh twice, but I realized that doing that actually caused the two sides to be slightly different, which you can see a little bit if you look closely from the side view. So I had to sort of do the mirroring after I used the lattice, but that would make it impossible for me to join sort of the middle section, because that would be after it's already transformed and not perfectly in the middle anymore. And you can also see that I have now at this point in time already switched to yet another attempt to sort of take a new lattice and deform it in a different way. This time I'm using a lattice that is quite simple, but it has depth, and so it was a lot of back and forth, and that's just how 3D is, in my opinion. There's lots of problems that you run into, but you have to learn to sort of figure them out, to work your way around it, improve your problem solving skills. It will really help you in this sort of job. Now, I did a little bit of a jump here, but you can see that I've finally been able to figure out a good way for how to create the hair, and I've also applied a new shader to the face for now. It's just a very simple shader, the way I introduced it before. And the next thing that I'm adding here is sort of a mesh that gives a color to those places where maybe we miss some hair, so just so that we never see sort of any spot where there's no hair growing, where there should be hair growing. So that's just a way to make sure that nothing strange ever shows up between the strands. So I'm bringing this into place, and then the last part will be the back side of the hair. And I decided to approach this final part of the hair by creating a duplicate of the front part. I copied the entire collection that I've set up, including the curve and the lattices and everything, and now my only task was to sort of stretch everything out a little bit, to make the hair longer, to change the shape to basically fit into what I needed from the back of the hair. But as for a theory standpoint, it's really nothing different at all. I'm really using exactly the same approach as the front part, and after some amount of adjustments, you can see that already I'm getting a pretty good result. Since we'll never be able to really see the front and the back at the same time, that's also an advantage for us, because it will not look like we were lazy. It's just the same thing, but it doesn't really show up too much. And that brings us pretty much to the end almost. I've added just very simple eyes, by the way, and I've changed some of the shader settings. Now I wanted to improve the look of the shading for the hair. So what I'm doing here is a bit advanced, and I'm missing the time for this video to explain it all, but I wanted to transfer the normals of this simplified sphere that I added to get a smooth shading line that goes across all three parts. I tried that, but it turned out that it wasn't too ideal for all parts. So while I used a data transfer modifier for some of the elements, I decided not to transfer the normals at full strength. So for the front hair, I would maybe use as sort of a normal edit modifier to give it a spherical look. I would use a little bit of data transfer for the back parts, but it's a mixture of different things, and I ended up not using them too much anyways. But we will be getting into normal editing, data transfer, and these sort of things probably in the next video, because I want to move on with shading the face. And so that's something to look forward to. Definitely a complicated topic, but one of the most important and useful things when it comes to stylized rendering. And one more time, this brings us to the end of this tutorial. Thank you very much for watching. As always, we talked today about the inverted hole method, about shading setups, about hair layout, and we looked at the time lapse of how I created the hair. If you liked this video, please, of course, leave a like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, you can also support me through Patreon, and I've posted the link in the description. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.